Hey guys, tonight we're not just drifting off a lullaby. We're stepping into the sandals of a Roman soldier, trudging down a dusty road under the relentless Mediterranean sun. You got your armor on, your gladius strapped to your side, and slung over your shoulder, a flask full of something that smells suspiciously like salad dressing. That's right, vinegar, not water, not wine. Vinegar. You raise the flask to your lips, take a cautious sip, and immediately scrunch up your face. It's sour, sharp, definitely not what you'd call refreshing. And yet, somehow, this is what keeps an entire empire marching across continents. If you tried to survive in this world without knowing what you were doing, without understanding why vinegar was more valuable than gold to a Roman soldier, you probably wouldn't make it past the first sandal blister, or the Legion commander yelling at you for forgetting your vinegar ration. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love imagining all of us drifting off together across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You tighten your grip on the flask, feel the weight of history pressing down on your shoulders, and wonder, why would an empire so obsessed with conquest, engineering, and public baths think that every soldier needed a daily dose of vinegar? Well, grab your blanket, because we're about to find out together. You trudge down the road, your boots kicking up a fine layer of dust that clings to your sweaty legs like an unwanted second skin. The sun beats down on your helmet, turning it into a slow-cooking oven for your brain. Around you, hundreds, no thousands, of other soldiers march in perfect formation, their armor glinting under the midday light. The rhythmic crunch of marching boots fills the air, steady as a heartbeat. This is life on the move in the Roman Empire. A world where roads are not just paths, but arteries of power, stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. And right now, you're somewhere in the middle of it all, following one of those famous Roman roads, the kind built with such precision that they still exist today, cracked and worn but stubbornly refusing to vanish. The military machine never stops. Legions march across provinces, conquering, securing borders, building fortifications. Every soldier must be ready to travel long distances under harsh conditions. No refrigeration, no bottled water, no Gatorade to replenish lost electrolytes. Just bread, salt, and, yes, vinegar. Because when you're marching through deserts, crossing rivers thick with mud, or camping in forests teeming with mosquitoes, you need something that won't spoil, something that can purify questionable water, something that gives you a little energy boost without rotting in your flask. Vinegar was more than just a condiment, it was survival. Soldiers carried it in small amphorae, leather flasks, or even clay bottles strapped to their belts. Some mixed it with water to make a drink called pasca, a sour, slightly fermented beverage that kept them hydrated and supposedly healthy. Others used it to clean wounds, disinfect equipment, or even preserve food. Historians still argue whether vinegar was truly effective at preventing disease, or if it was mostly psychological. Either way, one thing is clear. Without it, the Roman army wouldn't have marched nearly as far. So you keep walking, flask in hand, feeling the weight of history pressing down on you like the midday sun. You're not just carrying vinegar. You're carrying an empire. You shift your weight, adjusting the straps of your armor as the sun climbs higher. Sweat trickles down your back, pooling uncomfortably beneath your belt. The road ahead stretches endlessly, a ribbon of stone winding through fields of golden wheat and olive groves that seem to sway in slow motion under the heat. Somewhere nearby, a soldier mutters something about sandals made of goat hide and how they never quite fit, right unless you wanted blisters shaped like Roman numerals. This is life as a legionarius, a Roman legionary, and it's not all parades and triumphal arches. You wake before dawn, roused by the sharp clang of a bronze gong and the equally sharp voice of your centurion, reminding you that sleeping in means latrine duty. Your morning routine doesn't involve coffee or toast. Instead, you're handed a chunk of hardtack bread so dense it could double as a weapon, and a small flask of vinegar diluted with water. Breakfast, Roman style. You take a bite of the bread, chewing slowly, It's stale, dry, and tastes faintly of sawdust. To wash it down, you raise your flask and take a sip. The sour tang hits your tongue immediately, sharp enough to make your eyes water. But somehow it works. Somehow, this bizarre combination of rock-hard bread and acidic drink keeps you going. And it's not just you. Every soldier in the Legion gets the same ration: bread, salt, and vinegar. No wine unless you're an officer. No fancy spices unless you got connections in the quartermaster's tent. Just the basics: nutritious, filling, and most importantly, durable. Historians still argue whether vinegar was actually nutritious or if its benefits were more psychological. Some believe it helped prevent infections, especially in places where water sources were questionable. Others think it was mostly tradition, a habit passed down from earlier armies who discovered that sour drinks kept soldiers from getting sick. Either way, one thing is certain: without vinegar, the Roman army would have been a lot less effective. So you keep marching, your stomach settling into a dull ache that tells you this is just another day in the service of Rome. And somewhere deep inside your flask, history sloshes gently beside you. You take another sip from your flask, wincing slightly as a sharp tang spreads across your tongue. This isn't just a drink, it's an experience, a challenge, a daily ritual that somehow keeps you going despite its aggressive lack of refreshment. And yet, the more you think about it, the more you realize this vinegar isn't just for thirst, it's for everything. Because in the Roman army, vinegar is more than a ration, it's a tool, a multi-purpose substance that serves as medicine, disinfectant, and even currency in some cases. Soldiers use it to clean wounds after battle, believing it helps prevent infection. Officers soak their boots in it to keep them from rotting in damp weather. Some even swear by its ability to cure fevers, stomach ailments, or general exhaustion, though modern science would probably raise an eyebrow at that last one. And then there's the water, or rather, the questionable stuff that comes out of rivers, wells, and roadside puddles. You've seen soldiers scoop up murky liquid from a ditch and mix it with vinegar before drinking it like it's fine wine. Whether it actually purifies the water or just masks the taste is still up for debate. But hey, if nothing else, the acidity might slow down bacterial growth, enough to keep an army moving without mass illness, at least. Historians still argue whether vinegar was truly effective as a disinfectant, or if its benefits were mostly psychological. Some believe the Romans stumbled onto something useful long before germ theory was understood. Others think it was mostly tradition, passed down through generations of soldiers who learned early on that sour drinks kept them healthier than plain water. Either way, one thing is certain: vinegar wasn't just a snack, it was survival. So you tighten your grip on the flask, feeling the coolness of the clay against your palm, and remind yourself, in this world, hydration doesn't come from fruit juice or bottled spring water. It comes from something that tastes like regret. You wake before dawn. The sky is still a deep shade of navy, the stars above blinking like distant campfires. The world is quiet except for the occasional snore from your tent mate and the faint rustle of wind through the canvas walls. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows, off-key, as if it's not entirely convinced this early hour is worth the effort. Your body aches from yesterday's march, but there's no time to linger in your cot. The Roman army doesn't believe in sleeping in. You roll out your bedroll, stretch stiff limbs, and step outside into the cool morning air. The scent of damp earth rises beneath your sandals, mingling with the ever-present aroma of sweat, leather, and vinegar that seems to follow every soldier like an invisible companion. Breakfast is simple. No eggs, no toast, definitely no coffee. Instead, you're handed a chunk of hardtack bread, so dense it could double as a shield, and a small flask of diluted vinegar. It's the same meal every soldier gets: nutritious, filling, and most importantly, durable. You break off a piece of bread, chew slowly, and wash it down with a sip of the sour drink. It's not exactly gourmet, but somehow it works. Somehow, this bizarre combination of rock-hard bread and acidic liquid keeps you going. And it has to. It's been sustaining Legion for centuries. But why? Why would Rome, an empire obsessed with discipline, engineering, and public baths, settle on such an unappetizing breakfast? Well, for starters, hardtack lasts forever. Made from just flour and water, baked until it is tough as a centurion's glare, it can survive months, even years, without spoiling. Soldiers sometimes joke that it's so hard, you need to dunk it in vinegar just to soften it enough to chew. And then there's the vinegar itself. More than just a flavoring agent. It was believed to have health benefits. Some Romans thought it helped prevent illness, especially in places where water sources were questionable. Others saw it as a way to keep morale up. Something familiar, something sharp, something that reminded them they were alive even when their feet were blistered and their backs ached. Historians still argue whether vinegar was actually nutritious or if its benefits were mostly psychological. Some believe it helped prevent infections, especially in places where medical care was limited. Others think it was mostly tradition, passed down through generations of soldiers who learned early on that sour drinks kept them healthier than plain water. Either way, one thing is certain. Without vinegar, the Roman army wouldn't have marched nearly as far. So you finish your breakfast, feeling the warmth of the drink settle in your stomach, and remind yourself, in this world, comfort doesn't come from pancakes or porridge. It comes from something that tastes like regret, but keeps you marching anyway. You find yourself standing in a vineyard, the sun just beginning to rise over the rolling hills of Campania. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and ripened grapes, mingling with a faint tang of fermentation drifting from wooden barrels stacked near the farmhouse. Vines stretch out in neat rows, their heavy clusters of fruit glistening with dew. Somewhere nearby, a worker hums an old tune while slicing through the stems with a curved bronze blade, dropping plump bunches into a wicker basket balanced on his hip. This is where it all begins. Not wine for drunken banquets or temple offerings, but something more practical, more enduring. Because once the grapes are crushed, once the juice is left to ferment, once time and bacteria do their slow, patient work, you don't just get wine, you get vinegar. The Romans were no strangers to this process. They understood that wine, if left too long, would sour, oxidation, exposure to air, wild microbes lurking in the environment. All of it played a role in turning what was once intoxicating into something sharp, something useful. And rather than waste spoiled wine, they embraced it. Vinegar became a staple of daily life, especially for soldiers who needed something durable, something multipurpose, something that could survive months on campaign without rotting in his flask. Some vineyards even specialized in making vinegar intentionally. Large clay vats lined the courtyards, filled with diluted wine exposed to the open air. Workers stirred the liquid regularly, encouraging the growth of acetobacter, the bacteria responsible for converting alcohol into acetic acid. It wasn't fast. It could take weeks or even months, but by the time the vinegar was ready, it had a strength and flavor unlike anything you'd find in a modern kitchen. And then there was Pascha, the drink of choice for Roman legionaries. A mixture of water, vinegar, and sometimes a pinch of salt or herbs. It was tart, slightly fermented, and suspiciously close to something you might find growing in the back of your fridge if you forgot about it for a few weeks. But somehow it worked. Somehow. This bizarre combination of sour liquid and water kept thousands of soldiers marching across continents, surviving heat, dust, disease, and the occasional arrow to the shoulder. Historians still argue whether Pascha was actually nutritious or if its benefits were mostly psychological. Some believe the acidity helped prevent infections, especially in places where water sources were questionable. Others think it was mostly tradition, passed down through generations of soldiers who learned early on that sour drinks kept them healthier than plain water. Either way, one thing is certain. Without vinegar, the Roman army wouldn't have marched nearly as far. So you take another sip from your flask, feeling the familiar sting spread across your tongue, and remind yourself, in this world, refreshment doesn't come from citrus sodas or sports drinks. It comes from something that tastes like regret, but keeps you moving anyway. You find yourself in the middle of a battlefield, the air thick with dust, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. The ground is littered with broken shields, discarded spears, and the groans of wounded men lying on stretchers or propped up against overturned carts. Nearby, a surgeon, more butcher than healer by modern standards, is sawing off a soldier's shattered leg, while another holds him down, muttering prayers to Asclepius between clenched teeth. And somewhere in all this chaos, you spot it, a small clay jar labeled acetum, surrounded by bandages, scalpels, and bowls filled with something that looked suspiciously like pus. Vinegar. Because yes, in the Roman world, vinegar wasn't just for drinking. It was also medicine. Or at least it was believed to be. Surgeons used it to clean wounds, believing its sharp acidity would kill whatever invisible nastiness might be lurking beneath the skin. Soldiers soaked cloth in it before pressing it against cuts and gashes, convinced it would prevent infection. Officers poured it over arrow wounds, hoping it would sting enough to mask the pain, or at least distract from it. Some even drank it when they were sick, convinced it could cure fevers, stomach ailments, and general fatigue. Whether it actually worked is still up for debate. Modern science tells us that acetic acid does have mild antimicrobial properties, which might have helped slow bacterial growth in open wounds. But back then, it was mostly faith, tradition, and desperation. Historians still argue whether vinegar was truly effective as a medical treatment or if it was mostly psychological. Some believe the Romans stumbled onto something useful long before germ theory was understood. Others think it was mostly superstition, passed down through generations who learned early on that sour things kept them healthier than plain water. Either way, one thing is certain. In an army where amputation was often a preferred solution to infection, any substance that promised healing, even slightly, was worth carrying into battle. So you watch as the surgeon dips a cloth into the jar, wrings it out, and presses it against a fresh wound. The soldier flinches, but doesn't scream. Maybe it helps. Maybe it doesn't. But in a world without antibiotics, antiseptics, or painkillers stronger than wine, vinegar was the best option available. And as you tighten your grip on your own flask, feeling the coolness of the clay against your palm, you remind yourself, in this world, medicine doesn't come from white-coated doctors or sterile hospitals. It comes from something that tastes like regret, but might just save your life. You tighten your grip on your shield, the weight of it digging into your forearm as the enemy line surges forward. Dust kicks up around your boots, swirling in the dry air like a storm made of sweat and desperation. Horns blare. Orders are shouted. The clash of metal rings out across the battlefield as the first wave of soldiers collides with your unit. This is it, the moment you've trained for, the reason you march, drill, sweat, bleed, and yes, drink vinegar. Because when you're standing at the edge of chaos, when your heart pounds louder than the war drums, you need something to keep you steady. Something sharp, something grounding, something sour enough to remind you that you're still alive. So you reach for your flask, not for water, not for wine, for vinegar. You uncork it, tilt it back, and take a quick swig. The familiar sting spreads across your tongue, cutting through the dust and adrenaline like a blade. It's not refreshing. It's not pleasant. But somehow it works. Somehow, this bizarre combination of sour liquid and courage keeps you moving. Because in battle, focus matters. Clarity matters. And if nothing else, vinegar shocks your senses awake. Some soldiers swear by it. Claim it clears their head before a charge, steadies their hand before they throw a pilum, or even dulls the fear that creeps in before the first clash of shields. Others just do it because tradition says so. Either way, nobody questions it. Vinegar has been part of the Roman soldier's kit for centuries. And it's not just for morale. Vinegar has practical uses even in the heat of combat. Some soldiers soak their bandages in it before wrapping wounds, hoping to stave off infection before the battle even ends. Officers use it to clean blades between fights, keeping rust from forming on steel already stained with blood. And if you lose your grip on your sword, at least you can say you died hydrated. Historians still argue whether vinegar was truly effective in battle, or if its benefits were mostly psychological. Some believe the acidity helped prevent infections, especially in places where medical care was limited. Others think it was mostly tradition, passed down through generations of soldiers who learned early on that sour drinks kept them healthier than plain water. Either way, one thing is certain. Without vinegar, the Roman army wouldn't have marched nearly as far or fought nearly as hard. So you tuck your flask away, feel the coolness of the clay against your palm one last time, and raise your shield. The enemy is coming. Your comrades are beside you. And somewhere deep inside your gut, history sloshes gently beside you. Not just survival, preparation, determination, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of courage. You step away from the battlefield. Your armor still warm from the clash of swords and shields, your boots caked in dust and sweat. The adrenaline fades, replaced by a dull ache in your limbs and the slow realization that war isn't the only thing soldiers have to endure. There's the march afterward, the cleanup, the long trek back to camp or garrison, where blisters rub raw against leather straps and hunger gnaws at your stomach like a dog chewing on a sandal strap. And yet, even beyond the battlefield, vinegar follows you, because in Rome, vinegar isn't just for soldiers, it's for everyone. From the grand villas of senators to the cramped tenements of city dwellers, from bustling market stalls to quiet countryside farms, vinegar is everywhere. It flavors food, preserves meat, disinfects wounds, and even cleans floors. In a world without refrigeration, without modern medicine, without much in the way of hygiene beyond public baths and communal latrines, vinegar is one of few things you can always count on. Back in Rome itself, you find yourself walking to the Macellum, the city's central marketplace, where vendors shout over each other to sell fresh fish, olives, figs, and amphorae of oil and wine. But tucked between the spice sellers and butchers, there's a stall dedicated entirely to vinegar, rows of clay jars filled with different varieties, some aged longer than others, some infused with herbs, others left plain. A merchant proudly explains the differences: acetum for cooking, posca for drinking, and stronger brews used for medicinal purposes or cleaning. You watch as a woman buys a jar to soak her feet after a long day of weaving, another mixes it into a sauce for roasted pork, and a doctor purchases a bottle for his practice, muttering something about how it helps draw out infection. Vinegar isn't just food, it's medicine, antiseptic, and household cleaner all in one. Historians still argue whether vinegar was truly effective in these roles, or if its benefits were mostly psychological. Some believe the Romans stumbled onto something useful long before germ theory was understood. Others think it was mostly tradition, passed down through generations who learned early on that sour things kept them healthier than plain water. Either way, one thing is certain: without vinegar, Roman life wouldn't have been the same. So you tighten your grip on your flask, feeling the coolness of the clay against your palm, and remind yourself, in this world, comfort doesn't come from luxury alone. It comes from something that tastes like regret, but finds its place in every corner of life. You step into a Roman kitchen, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat, simmering stews, and the ever-present tang of vinegar. The room is warm, lit by oil lamps flickering against soot-stained walls. Clay pots line the shelves, filled with spices, oils, and, of course, vinegar in various forms. A cook stirs a bubbling pot over an open fire, dipping a wooden spoon into broth before adding a splash of something sharp from a small amphora. Because, yes, vinegar isn't just for soldiers. It's for everyone, especially when you're trying to make food last longer than a few hours in this blistering heat. The Romans were clever about preservation. Without refrigeration, without ice boxes, without vacuum-sealed plastic bags, they had to rely on salt, drying, and fermentation to keep their food from spoiling. And vinegar? Vinegar was one of their best tools. Take garum, that infamous fish sauce that somehow managed to be both delicious and horrifying at the same time. Made by fermenting fish guts in giant vats under the sun for weeks, sometimes months. It was pungent, salty, and strangely addictive. But even garum needed help staying fresh. So cooks would mix in vinegar to slow down spoilage, keeping their sauces rich and flavorful instead of rotten and useless. And then there were the vegetables. In a world where fresh produce didn't stay fresh for long, Romans soaked cucumbers, onions, and cabbage in vinegar to preserve them. This wasn't just about convenience. It was survival. When you lived in a place where summer heat could turn a meal into a science experiment within hours, having something sour enough to fight off bacteria was invaluable. Fruits got the same treatment. Figs, dates, and raisins were often stored in vinegar-soaked jars to keep them soft and sweet instead of shriveled and stale. Some recipes even call for soaking dried fruits in diluted vinegar before eating, giving them a slight tang while extending their shelf life. Even bread benefited from a splash of acidity. Bakers sometimes mix vinegar into dough to help it rise faster, using its natural yeast to create a lighter, fluffier loaf. And if your bread went stale, which it always did, because Roman hardtack was basically edible armor, You could soak it in vinegar to soften it up before chewing to what felt like a brick wrapped in flour. Historians still argue whether vinegar was truly effective as a preservative, or if it was mostly tradition passed down through generations. Some believe the acidity helped prevent mold and bacterial growth, especially in places where food spoiled quickly. Others think it was mostly about flavor, a way to add depth to dishes that might otherwise taste bland after sitting out too long. Either way, one thing is certain. Without vinegar, Roman cuisine wouldn't have been the same. So you take another sip from your flask, feeling the familiar sting spread across your tongue, and remind yourself, in this world, flavor doesn't come from fancy herbs or exotic spices alone. It comes from something that tastes like regret, but makes everything else worth eating. You find yourself aboard a merchant ship, the wooden deck creaking beneath your feet as the vessel cuts through the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean. The scent of salt and fish mingles with something sharper, something sour, that drifts in the cargo hold below. There, packed tightly between amphorae of olive oil, wine, and garum, sit dozens of clay jars labeled acetum. Vinegar. Because yes, vinegar wasn't just for soldiers or cooks. It was big business. In an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, trade routes carried everything from grain to gold, spices to silk. And among those goods, one of the most valuable commodities wasn't flashy or rare. It was practical, durable, sour. Vinegar traveled across land and sea, shipped in massive quantities to supply Roman garrisons, feed city dwellers, and flavor dishes in every province. Some came from Campania, where vineyards turned spoiled wine into something useful. Others were produced in Gaul, where local winemakers adapted Roman techniques to their own climate. Even as far away as Britannia, soldiers stationed along Hadrian's Wall relied on vinegar shipments to keep them hydrated, healthy, and slightly less miserable in the damp northern weather. And it wasn't just about taste or preservation. It was about economics. Vinegar production became a thriving industry, with specialized workshops dedicated to turning wine into something stronger, something more lasting. Large vats lined the courtyards of estates and urban centers alike, filled with diluted wine exposed to the open air. Workers stirred the liquid regularly, encouraging the growth of Acetobacter, the bacteria responsible for converting alcohol into acetic acid. It wasn't fast. It could take weeks or even months, but by the time the vinegar was ready, it had a strength and flavor unlike anything you'd find in a modern kitchen. Some varieties were aged longer, infused with herbs, or mixed with honey to create complex flavors. Others were left plain, meant for everyday use rather than gourmet meals. And whether it was used for cooking, cleaning, medicine, or hydration, vinegar was always in demand. Historians still argue whether vinegar was truly effective as a preservative or if its benefits were mostly psychological. Some believe the acidity helped prevent infections, especially in places where water sources were questionable. Others think it was mostly tradition, passed down through generations of soldiers who learned early on that sour drinks kept them healthier than plain water. Either way, one thing is certain. Without vinegar, the Roman economy wouldn't have functioned nearly as smoothly. So you lean against the ship's railing, watching the waves stretch endlessly ahead, and remind yourself, in this world, commerce doesn't come from luxury alone. It comes from something that tastes like regret, but keeps an empire running. You find yourself standing before a temple altar, the flickering glow of an oil lamp casting soft shadows on the stone figures surrounding you. The air is thick with incense, sweet and smoky, curling toward the ceiling like whispered prayers. Before you sit a modest offering, a few loaves of bread, a jug of wine, a handful of dried figs, and yes, a small clay jar of vinegar. Because in ancient Rome, food wasn't just for the living. It was for the gods, too. Vinegar had its own divine patrons, deities who watched over agriculture, health, and purification. Chief among them was Jupiter, king of the gods, protector of the state, an occasional thunder wielder when he felt particularly dramatic. He wasn't directly associated with vinegar, but as the god of order and justice, he benefited from offerings that kept soldiers strong and cities running smoothly. And if vinegar helped keep Rome's legions marching, then Jupiter probably appreciated it, even if indirectly. Then there was Minerva, goddess of wisdom, warfare, and crafts. She was often depicted with an owl, a spear, and an olive tree. symbols of knowledge, strategy, and industry. And since olive oil and vinegar often went hand in hand in Roman kitchens, it only made sense that she would accept both as offerings. Some temples even used diluted vinegar in purification rituals, believing it could cleanse both body and spirit before important ceremonies. And let's not forget Mars, the god of war himself. Soldiers prayed to him before battle, sacrificing animals, pouring libations, and leaving offerings at his altars. Vinegar may not have been flashy like wine or honey, but it was practical, something every soldier carried into combat. So if you were going to ask a divine favor before charging into enemy lines, why not pour out a splash of vinegar alongside your wine? Even household gods got in on the act. Lars and Penates, the protective spirits of the home, received small offerings daily: bits of bread, drops of wine, pinches of salt, and sometimes, if you were feeling particularly pious or particularly fond of vinegar, you might leave behind a few drops of that too. After all, if vinegar kept your family healthy, hydrated, and ready for whatever roamed through at them, it was worth honoring the spirits who helped make that happen. Historians still argue whether these vinegar offerings were meant to be consumed literally or spiritually. Some believe the gods accepted the essence of the food through scent alone. Others think the act of offering was more important than the physical item itself. Either way, one thing is clear. In a world where food was sacred, vinegar wasn't just a snack. It was worship. You find yourself in a bustling market square, but this time, it's not Rome you're standing in, it's somewhere else. Somewhere ancient but familiar. A place where people trade goods, share stories, and sip drinks that smell oddly like vinegar. Because yes, while the Romans may have made vinegar a staple of military life, they certainly weren't the only ones who loved it sour. Across the world, other civilizations had their own vinegar habits. Some similar, some wildly different, but all rooted in the same basic idea. When fruit ferments and wine spoils, what you get might just be useful. In China, for example, vinegar was more than just a condiment. It was medicine, philosophy, and cuisine all wrapped into one. The Chinese have been making vinegar for thousands of years, fermenting rice, millet, and even fruit to create something sharp enough to wake up the senses. Some believe it helped balance the body's energies, keeping yin and yang in harmony. Others use it to preserve vegetables, soak wounds, or even flavor dumplings before the first bite became a thing. Meanwhile, in the Andes, the Inca brewed something called chicha de mal, a fermented drink made from berries and spices. It wasn't exactly vinegar, but it had a similar tang, a sour kick that kept explorers and warriors going to the high-altitude trails of Machu Picchu. And like Roman soldiers with their pasca, Incan troops carried diluted versions of this drink on long marches, believing it gave them strength and endurance in thin mountain air. Over in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were already making vinegar thousands of years before Rome even existed. Records carved into clay tablets describe how they brewed beer, let it spoil, and then turn it into something sharp enough to disinfect wounds and preserve food. They even used it in religious rituals, offering jars of it to gods like Enki, the god of water and wisdom, as if to say, "Hey, we figure out how to make something last forever. Here's some of our best stuff." And in India, vinegar took on yet another form. Tamarind, date, and coconut vinegars became common ingredients in cooking, adding depth to curries, chutneys, and pickles. Some Ayurvedic texts even claim vinegar could help with digestion, weight loss, and general well-being, claims that modern science still debates today. Historians still argue whether these cultures influence each other or develop their vinegar traditions independently. Some believe trade routes carried fermentation techniques across continents, spreading knowledge of sour liquids along with spices, textiles, and ideas. Others think humans just naturally figured out that when things go bad, sometimes they go good in a different way. Either way, one thing is certain. Vinegar wasn't just a Roman thing. It was a human thing. So you take another sip from your flask, feeling familiar sting spread across your tongue, and remind yourself, in this world, survival doesn't come from invention alone. It comes from something that tastes like regret, but finds its way into every culture, everywhere, always. You stand on the edge of a crumbling Roman road, watching as dust swirls in the wind like the last echoes of an empire that once stretched across continents. The sun beats down on your back, but the world around you feels strangely quiet, like history itself is holding its breath. Gone are the marching boots, the clinking armor, the disciplined shouts of centurions barking orders. Instead, all you hear is the occasional rustle of wind through dry grass and the distant call of a crow circling above, because Rome has fallen. And with it, the golden age of vinegar in the military has quietly faded too. The legions disbanded long ago, their standards buried beneath centuries of dirt and forgotten battles. The roads still exist, cracked and worn, but they no longer carry thousands of soldiers to war. The great fortresses have crumbled into ruins, overtaken by vines and time. And yet, despite all this decay, one thing remains: vinegar. Not in the hands of soldiers, not strapped to belts or carried in amphorae from marching armies, but in kitchens, markets, and homes across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Because even though Rome fell, vinegar never did. It simply changed roles. No longer the drink of choice for legionaries trudging across deserts, it became something else entirely. A staple of medieval cooking, a preservative for peasants storing food through harsh winters, a medicine used by monks who believed in its healing properties. Some cultures adapted Roman techniques, refining them over centuries. Others developed their own versions, fermenting apples, rice, or wine into something sharp enough to survive time itself. Historians still argue whether vinegar's decline in the military was due to changing tastes, the collapse of centralized supply chains, or simply the rise of new beverages like beer and ale. Some believe that as warfare evolved and professional standing armies gave way to feudal levies and mercenaries, the need for a standardized ration like Pascha disappeared. Others think that as medical knowledge advanced, people began to question whether vinegar was truly effective at preventing disease, or if it was mostly tradition passed down through generations who trusted sour drinks more than questionable water sources. Either way, one thing is certain: vinegar survived. It didn't vanish when Rome did. It didn't fade into obscurity like so many other ancient customs. Instead, it endured, quietly, stubbornly, always finding a place in human life. Whether in the barrels of Renaissance apothecaries, the cellars of French winemakers perfecting balsamic, or the spice racks of modern kitchens where bottles still bear the name of sedum, vinegar kept going. So you take another sip from your flask, now more relic than necessity, and remind yourself, in this world, legacy doesn't come from conquest alone. It comes from something that tastes like regret, but refuses to be forgotten. You sit beneath the shade of a crumbling Roman arch, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked stone road. The wind carries whispers of time, distant echoes of marching boots, clinking armor, and the occasional grunt of a soldier muttering about vinegar-soaked bread. Around you, the world has changed. Empires have risen and fallen. Armies have marched under different banners. And yet, somehow, something as simple as vinegar has endured. Because that's what vinegar does. It lasts. Even now, centuries later, you can still find it in kitchens, pantries, and medicine cabinets around the world. No longer carried by soldiers into battle, no longer diluted with water to make Pascha, but still present in salad dressings, marinades, pickling jars, and even home remedies whisper from one generation to the next. Some people swear by its health benefits. Others just like the way it sharpens the flavor of food. Either way, its legacy lives on. And if you think about it, that's kind of beautiful. A humble liquid born from spoiled wine, turned into something useful, something necessary, something that followed an empire across continents and outlived it by centuries. Vinegar didn't need gold or conquest or grand monuments to survive. It simply existed, sour, persistent, quietly essential. Historians still argue whether vinegar was truly effective as medicine, as hydration, as a disinfectant. Some believe the Romans stumbled onto something useful long before germ theory was understood. Others think it was mostly tradition, passed down through generations who learned early on that sour things kept them healthier than plain water. Either way, one thing is certain. Without vinegar, history would taste a little less interesting. So you lean back against a cool stone, take one last sip from your flask, now more symbolic than practical, and let the weight of history settle over you like a warm blanket. The past may be gone, but its flavors linger, its traditions persist. And somewhere in some dusty kitchen or bustling market, someone is still using vinegar the same way the Romans did. Because some things never go out of style. Not war, not roads, not even empires. But vinegar? Vinegar sticks around. The wind slows. The sun sinks lower, its golden light stretching across the ruins like a final farewell. You feel it now, not just in your bones, but in the quiet hush of the world around you. The past breathes gently beside you, not with fanfare or war drums, but with stillness, with peace. You lean back against the warm stone, letting your breath slow, letting your thoughts drift like dust caught in a breeze. No rush, no need to chase anything. Just this, just now, just the soft hum of history, settling into silence. Around you, nothing moves. Not the crumbling arch above, not the cracked road beneath your feet, not the distant hills where time has stood still for centuries. Everything waits, quietly, patiently. And so, do you? Your body feels heavier now, sinking gently into the stillness, like sand settling after a long day's wind. Your mind softens, stretches, slows, like honey dripping from a spoon on a summer afternoon. No sharp edges, no sudden turns, just warmth, just ease, just the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat, slowing, softening, fading, like the hush of a world that knows how to rest, like the gentle turning of stars above a sleeping earth. And somewhere deep inside your flask, history sloshes gently beside you, not forgotten, not lost, just waiting, waiting for someone else to take a sip, to remember, to march forward once more. But not tonight. Tonight is for stillness, for silence, for sleep. So let go. Let your breath slow even more. Let your body sink deeper into this ancient hush. There is no hurry, no place to be, just a quiet, steady rhythm of your heart, beating slower now, softer, quieter. Good night, traveler. Sleep well, dream softly, and may your journey, like the vinegar beside you, last forever,